Hello StoryLine users, this is Owen Holt once again with another tutorial, one that I would like to call When is a Dial Not a Dial? And the answer is when it's a joystick. So I was playing around working on some things for a client who was trying to do a simulation of a loading crane, and I thought something that is somewhat related is a claw game, very similar to what you see in toy stores or carnivals or wherever you may see them. Oh, we have them in the grocery store here, but it's the very simple concept of a machine that slides back and forth and that raises and lowers a chain, and the idea is to line up with the object of your desire, which I'm struggling to get just right here. And then if you get in just the right location where you can get a secure grip on it, you can close the claws on it and then lift the object over to the drop location. And once we position it firmly in the drop area, we can drop it, and away we go. We had some success. So the idea was to help this client first create joysticks that would work similar to what a crane is doing, and create some other functionality behind it. And I ran into some challenges as I went along, and I thought I would share some of those with you today. The first thing before I dive into this is just a reminder, this relies heavily on variables and on triggers. And so I know I get asked the question a lot on, how do I think of variables? And the easiest way that I can teach somebody variables is to tell them a variable is really just a container. It's just a container. They can hold text, they can hold numbers, they can hold a true or false state. But by themselves, they really don't have a lot of value until you do something with them. It's like having a glass of beer. It does me no good if it just sits there on the counter and I look at it, right? I need to do something with it. I need to drink it, or I need to put another glass of beer next to it and compare the color, or I need to, you kind of get the idea here. It's only doing so much good until you do something with the container by looking at it, examining it, modifying it. Maybe I dump the beer out and I put rum in, right? Now I've got something completely different in that container. So you modify it, you present it, you analyze it, you do other actions based on what's contained there. If my variable is a swimming pool and I've filled it with water, my action that I'm going to do is to dive right in. But if that variable swimming pool is now filled with cement, when I get to the trigger that says dive, if the pool is safe, I'm going to say, no, that's probably not safe. I'm not going to dive. So we can use it to modify or determine some action. That's it. That's variables. They're really actually clean and simple, and I think sometimes we overcomplicate them. They're important when you combine them with triggers. So a trigger, again, I'm going to describe it in the simplest form. A trigger is more than just something occurs, which to me, the term trigger sounds very actiony, right? And it is. There is some action. They follow a very specific format or pattern. Do something when something else occurs. A timeline ends, or a button is hovered over, or a button is clicked, or there's some triggering event, which is where the term trigger comes from, that causes StoryLine to do something. And you're going to tell it, do this when this other thing occurs. And then we can even introduce other variables that we just talked about to set conditions to say, but only if this condition is met. Only if that beer glass is full of beer, right? So the simplest example I can give is shooting a gun, right? Fire the bullet, that's the do something. When? Well, when the trigger is pulled, under what condition? If there is a bullet in the chamber, that might be one of the conditions, and if I am not aiming towards a person because I want to be safe here, right? So that's a pretty simple example of how these different things work together. It's just do something when something else occurs if these conditions exist, right? So the other thing that I want to introduce a little bit is the concept of custom dials in StoryLine. So now that we've set a little bit of groundwork, let's go ahead and look at my actual file. And I've set it up here with a joystick and a truck, and I'm ready to dive in and make this joystick a dial. So how do I do that? Well, first of all, my joystick it's actually two different objects. It's the stick itself sitting on top of the base. The only thing that we're going to be moving and rotating is the joystick itself. And if I look at my insert and I look at dial, I have the option under dial of taking anything and converting it to a dial. So I'm going to convert my stick into a dial. Now, I've got this nice arc that it's going to follow. And right here in the middle, I have the rotation point. This is what everything's going to rotate around. Well, right now, that's just going to spin my stick around. If I start to slide this around, you can see that's not the behavior I want, right? So I'm going to grab that rotation point and drag it down here to my base. So now my dial shifts around that base, which looks much more joystick-like. Okay, so I can fiddle around with it till I get it to be just the right rotation point. That looks pretty good to me. I may actually just drop this base down a little bit lower. And if we come back here and preview just this slide, you'll notice the truck has some animation going on. Ignore that. All we're looking at is, does that joystick look and move right? It sure does. I like that. That's nice, smooth rotation. I've now turned a dial into something that works. Now we need to tie some actions to it. So there's a little more that I want to do to it. If I come back into the format of the dial itself, so I look at the design one. I'm going to call this truck so that I can identify. This is automatically creating a variable, and I want to be able to find it among all of my other variables. I can set the rotation if I don't want it to go a full 180 degrees. I can tip that down to something else. Let's say I only want to go 90 degrees. I can type it directly in. I can set my starting value as something else. Now, I don't want my joystick to necessarily start out like that, so I may need to rotate it back into a straight up and down position. Oops, I just moved the wrong thing. I actually want to grab those to reorient the slider. So now I've got just a slight movement restricted. Set my starting value of 1 and my end value. Set my initial value of 3, my end value of 5. So now I've just reduced some of the stops in here. Again, if I preview this slide, I can see my joystick now is maybe not quite as smooth, but it's good enough. And I can now assign different actions to occur or stop different actions from occurring at those different stops, right? So what do I want to have occur? Well, on this truck, we'll look, I already set up a couple of motion path animations. These animations are line motion paths. They have a relative starting point, and so they're going to move along a line. So I can say that I want to move this along motion path. So let's rename that from motion path 1 to right. I think the other one's already left. So we're going to move it along line motion path right. And on this motion path, let's rename it left. And we don't want that to happen when the timeline starts. We want to have that happen when a variable changes. And the variable that we're changing, we just called truck. And let's set a condition. If you remember, we labeled these 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So let's set a condition that we're only going to move that on truck if the variable truck is equal to 5. Okay, simple enough. And on our other trigger, we're going to do the same. We're going to move it along. We're going to drive the truck in reverse, essentially. When variable changes, the variable is going to be truck on the condition if truck is equal to 1. So let's just preview that. So I can move it that way, I can move it in reverse. Now you'll notice something kind of weird is going on. It's sort of jumping. And it's because it's cutting off one animation in the middle of it, and the animations are set at different speeds. So sometimes it seems to be a smoother transition, but I need to make sure that all of my animations are set to relative. It looks like that one is not. So close preview. Let's look at the path options. Relative start point, path options, relative start point should be selected. It's not. It is now. It's selected. Okay. So let's preview this again. So my truck drives forward. My truck goes in reverse. My truck goes in reverse. My truck goes in reverse. Now I can go further and set this to set some boundaries so that the truck won't drive off of the screen, and I can start to look at what is its location. And you'll notice right now I have to keep pushing this. What if I want it to be in a continuum motion? So that's where things can start to get very complicated with your variables. So I'm going to come back here to this screen, and you can see what you start to end up with is a lot of, actually I'm going to undock that and make it a little bit bigger here for you. So you can see we start to have a lot of slide triggers. Set position. So I have some additional variables. I want to know where is my claw horizontally, where is the chain that drops down in the claw assembly located vertically. So I have these positions, and I want to make sure that at the very beginning of the slide, everything is set to 1, 1, which is this location. And then I also noticed that if I looped the animation to follow itself, I ran into problems if I reversed the path, and I could eventually work something by toggling very quickly from moving left to moving right, reorient where that starting point was. So my position 1, if I reverse things, and because everything is a relative animation, it could eventually sort of shift my boundary to here and clear off the screen, or the other way around. So I had to only allow the animation to loop if the animation was showing as active. So I needed another variable to say, am I already moving horizontally? Am I already moving vertically? And I needed to change that active to false when I hit my boundaries of 15 and 0 and 9 and 1. So you'll notice I have a left or a right boundary and a left boundary for horizontal, and I have a bottom boundary and a top boundary on my vertical. And then I have the full assembly, which is the chain and the box. Everything is grouped together, and I have animations on that. And then I have animations on the subassembly, which is just the chain part with the claw, and those are controlled as well. So I have two different joysticks. And you can see that this starts to become very complex. And again, if we just preview, and if you pay attention now to the variables, right? So right now nothing is active. If I start to move this, the horizontal was set to true, and that allows everything to move. If I try to reverse really fast, so in this case, it stopped. It's not actually letting me move to the left because I reversed it too quickly and the animation to the right hadn't completed. So it can be a little bit sticky if somebody's trying to move really fast or too fast. They might have to toggle it up and get it started again, right? But the point of that was to actually keep everything on the screen. If I didn't have that active inactive piece in there, again, you could work your starting points clear off of the screen. The last thing that I struggled with that I want to share with you is sometimes when something starts to look incredibly complex, like my StoryLine file was with all of my if-then statements and my and conditions and everything else. You can see that starts to fill up over here. I really struggled with getting the puppy. I was going to put a teddy bear there, but the stuffed puppy to move with the claw. And I was applying the same animations to it and adding all those to the triggers, and it was creating something incredibly complex with all the variables and conditions. And after all of that, it never seemed to move quite in sync. Even though I used the animation painter, the lengths of the animations were the same, everything was identical. It should have worked in theory. But always, time and time again, my puppy would start out firmly in the claw here, and by the time I dropped it over here, the claw had moved off of the puppy a little bit. And it wasn't by much, but it was enough that it just looked wrong. And I couldn't figure it out. And again, I was trying to take something that I knew everything else had been complex, so I assumed this would be complex too. Well, the answer was really simple. Instead of moving the puppy, I made the puppy part of the claw. And what I mean by that is, if I close preview here, what you'll notice is that on the claw itself, I have a state, and that state has the puppy already there in the claw. And if I come down and look at the puppy, I have a normal and I have a hidden state. So what I actually ended up doing that worked seamlessly was to create an option where, and create the variables around this that basically say, with the slider, grab the puppy is equal to true, and so that there's something that changes a variable to be true that says if the claw and everything is at a specific location, you can grab the puppy and change the state of the dog to hidden. So I'm going to change some states. I'm going to grab the puppy, and I have some conditions based on the location of my horizontal variable and my vertical variable that sets whether or not those conditions can be met and are true. So it's a bit complex, but again, you could do all kinds of fun things with this. You can turn, like I said, you can turn anything into a dial and use sort of that rotation a rotating slider sort of effect to do some cool things. In this case, I turned it into a joystick. This, instead of a little stuffed puppy, could be different learning menu items, and you could create an interactive menu where the user grabs what they want to learn about next, and they drop it into the learning machine, and it spits out their next module. I mean, there are all kinds of creative things that you could do with this, but I wanted to walk you through kind of, again, this is a work in progress. I'll go ahead and post the file as is if anyone's interested in digging in and tearing this apart a little bit. There's no JavaScript involved. This is all triggers and variables and states and dials and sliders. So with that, again, I wish you good luck with your projects and happy authoring.